Everyone knows the San Andreas Fault works like a clock. If you live in California, or even if you just pay attention to the news, you have been taught this basic geological rhythm since you were a child. They tell us that the tectonic plates beneath our feet are constantly grinding against each other, building up immense pressure. And they tell us that this pressure is safely released in predictable, manageable intervals. Specifically, everyone points to the Parkfield segment of the San Andreas Fault. For over a century, this specific stretch of land in central California has ruptured with a magnitude 6 earthquake almost exactly every 22 years. It happened in 1857, 1881, 1901, 1922, 1934, 1966, and 2004. It is the most heavily monitored earthquake zone on the planet. Geologists call it a reliable safety valve. The Earth builds tension. The Earth shakes, the tension is released, and the clock resets. We are told that this regular creeping motion prevents the catastrophic buildup that causes megaquakes. It makes sense. It is comforting. It makes the ground beneath our feet feel manageable and safe. But what if this predictable rhythm was never a safety valve? What if the unusual quiet along the fault line right now is not safety, but the calm right before the trap snaps shut? Is everything we were told about predictable 22-year earthquake cycles a lie designed to keep millions of people from panicking? Is this the final sign? The problem is that there are 3 layers to this story. And the final layer is the one nobody wants to hear. That is layer 0. The comforting idea that the Earth operates on a schedule we can track and trust. The idea that as long as we monitor the 22-year clock, we are safe. But if you look closer, it is not exactly like that. In 2024, a team of researchers from the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, working alongside the United States Geological Survey, published a study that shattered this illusion. Dr. Luca Malagnini and his colleagues did not just look at when the earthquakes happened. They looked at how the physical rock itself was behaving deep underground. They measured something called seismic wave attenuation, specifically the Q-1 factor. You do not need to be a geophysicist to understand what this means. Imagine tapping on a solid, perfect bell. It rings clearly, the vibration traveling freely through the metal. Now, imagine tapping on a bell that is cracked, strained, and locked under immense crushing pressure. The sound is muffled. The energy dissipates differently. That is exactly what seismic attenuation measures. It measures how the Earth transmits energy through the crust. Before the 2004 Parkfield earthquake, the attenuation data showed a very specific, recognizable pattern. The rock was fracturing on a microscopic level, and fluids were moving through the crust as they always had. The Earth was preparing to slip. The safety valve was working exactly as the 22-year clock predicted. But the 2024 measurements showed something entirely different. The pattern has completely broken. The physical dissipation of energy along the Parkfield segment has measurably diverged from its historic pre-rupture state. The fault is not creeping normally. It is not showing the microfractures that precede a healthy release of pressure. Instead, the high-precision telemetry data indicates abnormal stress retention. The mechanical strain behavior of the fault has objectively altered. The 22-year clock did not just pause. The internal physics of the rock itself changed. This means that the tectonic plates are still moving at roughly 33 millimeters per year. The massive Pacific plate is still pushing northwest. The North American plate is still resisting with everything it has. The energy is still being generated every single day, but the safety valve is jammed. The energy is not being released through regular manageable slips. It is being trapped. It is being locked into the crust under unyielding, unimaginable pressure. The silence you hear when you walk outside is not the absence of danger. It is the sound of the earth holding its breath. This requires us to look even closer at what happens when tectonic plates are denied their natural release. The friction does not simply pause. It evolves. The rock itself begins to undergo fundamental molecular changes. When the fluid dynamics within the crust shift, as measured by the attenuation data, the very lubrication that allows for minor slips is squeezed out or redirected. This creates a state of hyperlocking. The two sides of the fault fuse together under the unimaginable weight of the continental plates. Every passing day adds millions of tons of pressure to a system that is no longer capable of bleeding it off. And because this energy cannot travel horizontally through normal creep, it begins to force its way downward and outward, triggering secondary faults that have lain dormant for millennia. This is where things start to get uncomfortable. Because if the energy is not being released at Parkfield, it does not just vanish. Physics dictates that it must go somewhere. Not long ago, I was looking at the raw telemetry data from that 2024 study. For a long time, I believed in the 22-year cycle just like everyone else. It was clean. It made mathematical sense. I used to think that as long as we tracked the intervals, we could anticipate the danger and prepare for it. But looking at the drastic shift in the Q-1 factor, my entire perspective inverted. The data proved that the fault was no longer following the historical script. The physical properties of the Earth had fundamentally shifted. The conviction I held about the predictability of the San Andreas fault dissolved in an instant. I realized we were not waiting for a delayed train. We were standing on a bomb whose fuse had just been rewired in the dark. Because of this locked state at Parkfield, the entire seismic equation of California changes. This is layer 2. The danger is much deeper than a localized anomaly. When a creeping segment fails to rupture on schedule, the unreleased strain transfers directly into adjacent locked segments. In 2024, high-resolution geodetic modeling, specifically four-dimensional earthquake cycle simulations conducted by Lillian Burkhard and the Southern California Earthquake Center, revealed exactly where this trapped energy is going. The simulations showed persistent triggered creep and stress transfer moving away from Parkfield and pushing directly into the Garlock Fault and the Cajon Pass segment of the southern San Andreas. Think about what that actually means for a second. Cajon Pass is not some remote, empty stretch of desert. It is a critical, heavily populated urban corridor. It is the massive gateway between the Mojave Desert and the sprawling metropolis of the Los Angeles Basin. Millions of people live, work, and commute through the exact zones where this stress is accumulating. The silence at Parkfield is actively loading the gun aimed at one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. The stress accumulation is increasing the total potential rupture magnitude. We are no longer looking at a manageable magnitude 6 event. We are looking at the tectonic framework preparing for a massive multi-fault rupture that our infrastructure was never designed to handle. When you consider the sheer scale of what is locked beneath California, the numbers start to lose their meaning. We talk about magnitude 7 or magnitude 8 as if they are just points on a graph. But a magnitude 8 earthquake releases 32 times more energy than a magnitude 7. It is not a linear progression. It is exponential devastation. The energy currently being trapped by the altered attenuation at Parkfield is not just adding to a localized problem. It is feeding a continental-scale stress network. The Garlock Fault, which intersects with the San Andreas, acts like a massive tectonic hinge. When the strain transfers there, it creates a cross-loading scenario. This means the pressure is not just pushing forward, it is twisting the crust, creating a volatile torque that can trigger multiple faults simultaneously. This is the reality that the four-dimensional simulations laid bare. The Earth does not respect the neat, isolated fault lines we draw on maps. Beneath the surface, it is a single, interconnected web of fracturing rock and shifting fluids. When one node locks up, the entire network feels the strain. The silence at Parkfield is echoing through the Cajon Pass, resonating down into the Los Angeles basin and sending stress waves into fault systems we have barely begun to map. This phenomenon of deep, silent shifting before a catastrophe is not unprecedented. We have seen what happens when subterranean dynamics alter before the surface breaks. Historical records from the Ansei era in Japan, documented by the Earthquake Research Institute in 1855, detail how observers noted sudden, inexplicable changes in deep well water clarity. They recorded periods of absolute micro-tremor silences just days before massive ruptures tore the cities apart. This was the result of those deep, hyper-locked subterranean veins fracturing under the silent strain. The Earth always signals its intentions, not with noise, but with an eerie, profound quiet that precedes the violence. 2 weeks prior to the magnitude 6.9 Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, a researcher at Stanford University named Dr. Anthony Fraser Smith recorded an unprecedented spike in ultra-low-frequency magnetic field fluctuations using a sensor in Corralitos, California. The signal intensified 3 hours before the quake hit. It was empirical proof that deep physical and electromagnetic shifts occur long before a major fault violently ruptures. The intense grinding of quartz-rich rock deep underground generates massive electrical currents. When the fault is locked and the stress reaches critical mass, these currents spike, radiating outward through the crust. It is a silent alarm, a planetary warning system that we are only just beginning to learn how to read. The Earth groans beneath the surface long before the ground breaks. The shift in fluid dynamics, the change in attenuation, the magnetic spikes, these are the hidden symptoms of a planet in distress. But wait, that is not the worst part. We have established that the physical rock has changed. We have established that the pressure is transferring to major urban centers, locking up energy instead of releasing it. But here is the third layer, and this is the part that nobody wants to talk about. Go back for a second to that phrase from the beginning. The idea that the San Andreas Fault works like a predictable clock. Now you see what it was hiding. It was a comforting lie we told ourselves because the alternative was too terrifying to face. The 22-year cycle was the version of reality that needed to be true for millions of people to sleep at night. Not the version that actually was. It was a mathematical illusion that blinded us to the deeper, more chaotic nature of the Earth. When you strip away the modern scientific terminology, the high-resolution geodetic modeling, and the seismic attenuation factors, you are left with a physical reality that was described long before we had the instruments to measure it. I spent 22 years working as a reference librarian, managing local newspaper archives, microfilms, and historical records. You learn a lot when you spend decades cataloging the history of disasters and the warnings that preceded them. You start to see patterns that span across centuries, patterns that connect cold, hard scientific data with ancient oral traditions. You see how people try to articulate terrifying natural phenomena using the language of their time. And when I cross-reference the 2024 attenuation data with historical prophetic records, the parallel was chilling. In 1989, biographical records and oral archives documented by Krasimira Stoyanova detailed the visions of the Bulgarian mystic Baba Vanga. Skeptics love to point out that Vanga never mentioned the San Andreas Fault or modern California by name. But ancient and oral prophetic traditions relied on vivid physical metaphors, not 21st century geographic terminology. They spoke in images, in physical sensations, in massive shifts that could be felt in the bone. Vanga described the western land where gold was dug. She described a catastrophic earth shift that would not begin with a sudden violent collapse. Instead, her documented accounts explicitly stated that it would begin with a subtle, unseen groan beneath the western soil. She described subterranean fluid dynamics shifting and changing long before the surface rupture occurred. She spoke of a silence that was not peace, but preparation. Look at the wording again. An unseen groan beneath the soil. Subterranean fluid dynamics shifting. Now look back at the Malagnini study. What does the change in the Q-1 factor represent? It represents abnormal stress retention, the closing of microfractures, and the literal alteration of fluid movement deep within the crust. The scientific anomaly perfectly mirrors the ancient prophecy. The silence we are measuring today, the locked state of the fault, is the unseen groan she described decades ago. This is not a coincidence. This is the Earth acting exactly as both modern geophysics and ancient visionaries warned it would. The Hopi Declaration to the United Nations in 1992, delivered by Thomas Banyasya and traditional elders, echoed the exact same warning. They spoke of the great shaking of Turtle Island, North America, and described the prelude as a period when deep western subterranean veins stop moving normally and grow silent. The ancient warnings were never about the moment the ground breaks. They were always about the quiet that precedes it. The Hopi elders spoke of the subterranean veins growing silent because they understood that the Earth is a living system. When a living system goes quiet, it is not resting. It is bracing for impact. The shift in fluid dynamics, the change in the Q-1 factor, the trapped tectonic energy. These are the physical manifestations of that bracing. If you look at the broader historical context, every major civilization that has lived along a fault line has developed a specific vocabulary for this phenomenon. The ancient Greeks wrote about the unnatural stillness of the air and the retreat of subterranean waters before massive tremors. The indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest have oral traditions detailing how the Earth would seem to hold its breath right before the Cascadia subduction zone unleashed its fury. They did not have high-precision telemetry or four-dimensional geodetic modeling. They had observation, memory, and a deep, visceral connection to the rhythms of the planet. What makes our current situation so uniquely terrifying is the intersection of this ancient awareness with our modern data-driven denial. We have the instruments. We can measure the exact millimeter of strain accumulating along the Garlock fault. We can track the precise alteration in seismic wave attenuation. We have the data telling us, in cold, hard numbers, that the 22-year cycle is dead and the pressure is building. Yet, we still cling to the comforting lie. We still tell ourselves that the silence is just a statistical delay. Consider the implications of this shift. When the Ansei-era observers noted the deep well water clarity changing, they were observing the exact same fluid dynamic shift that the Malagnini study measured in 2024. The difference is that they had no geological framework to understand it. They saw the symptom, but they could not diagnose the disease. Today, we have both the symptom and the diagnosis, yet we act with the same ignorance. We treat the absence of a magnitude 6 earthquake at Parkfield as a stroke of luck, a temporary reprieve from the inevitable. We fail to recognize that the Earth does not give reprieves. It only reallocates force. The cross-loading scenario on the Garlock fault is particularly insidious. Because the San Andreas and the Garlock intersect, they influence each other in ways that linear models cannot predict. When the Cajon Pass segment absorbs the locked energy from Parkfield, it creates a choke point. Imagine a massive river suddenly dammed up. The water does not stop flowing. It backs up, it seeks weak points in the banks, and eventually it breaches with catastrophic violence. The tectonic strain is the river. The locked segment is the dam. And the millions of people living in the Los Angeles basin are standing directly in the floodplain. This is the reality of the unseen groan. It is the sound of the dam cracking under the pressure. The ultra-low frequency magnetic spikes recorded by Dr. Fraser Smith were the electromagnetic equivalent of those cracks forming. They were the invisible warnings of a structure pushed beyond its physical limits. And just as the Loma Prieta earthquake followed those spikes, the eventual rupture of the southern San Andreas will follow the current period of abnormal stress retention. The only difference is the scale. Loma Prieta was a localized tragedy. A multi-fault rupture triggered by the hyper-locking of Parkfield and Cajon Pass would be a generational catastrophe. We must understand that prophecy in its truest form is not magic. It is observation elevated to the level of myth. When Baba Vanga described the western land groaning, she was not peering into a mystical crystal ball. She was tapping into the universal language of the earth. She was articulating the physical reality of a planet that communicates its distress through silence, through shifting fluids, and through the slow, agonizing buildup of unreleased tension. The tragedy is that we have spent so much time debating the mystical nature of her visions that we completely ignored their terrifying geological accuracy. We are standing on the precipice of a shift that will redefine the Western landscape. The modern science has finally caught up to the ancient visions, not by proving them wrong, but by giving us the exact measurements of their terrifying accuracy. The cracked bell is muffling the energy, the subterranean veins have stopped moving normally, and the trap is set. The only question left is not if it will snap shut, but when the silence will finally break. The Hopi elders understood this psychological impact as well. In their 1992 declaration, they did not just warn of the physical shaking. They warned of the spiritual and mental toll it would take on a society that had disconnected itself from the earth. When you live on top of a locked fault line, the anxiety becomes a permanent part of your daily existence. Every rumble of a heavy truck, every distant sonic boom, every minor tremor sends a spike of adrenaline through your system. You are living in a constant state of hypervigilance, waiting for the floor to drop out from under you. This is the unseen cost of the locked fault. It is not just the physical infrastructure that is under strain, it is the human infrastructure as well. And this anxiety is entirely justified. When you read that fault creep slowed down or changed direction, the media often spins it as a positive. They tell you that the fault has stabilized, but the data tells a different story. The data tells you that the energy is getting locked and trapped under immense pressure. It tells you that the silence is a lie. The people who laugh it off, the transplants who have never felt their walls flex and their foundations crack, they do not understand the reality of the ground they are standing on. But those who grew up here, those who remember Loma Prieta and Northridge, they know. They know that the infrastructure is fragile, that the power grids are vulnerable, and that the 22-year cycle was the only thing keeping the nightmare at bay. Now that the cycle is broken, the nightmare is no longer a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. The stress redistribution simulations have drawn the map. The seismic attenuation data has confirmed the locked state. The historical records and the ancient prophecies have provided the context. The Earth has given us every warning it possibly can. The rest is up to us. We can continue to cling to the comforting illusion of the 22-year clock, or we can face the reality of the unseen groan. We can prepare for the inevitable, or we can be consumed by it. This cognitive dissonance is perhaps the most dangerous element of all. When the Earth finally releases this pent-up energy, the physical destruction will be compounded by our collective psychological unpreparedness. The infrastructure will fail because it was built for the manageable slips of the past, not the massive, locked-up rupture of the future. But the societal fabric will fracture because we refuse to listen to the unseen groan when we had the chance. The warnings are not meant to paralyze us with fear. They are meant to shatter the illusion of control so we can face the reality of our environment. Baba Vanga did not speak of the subterranean shifts to spread despair. She spoke of them because they were an inevitable part of the Earth's cycle, a cycle that we must respect if we are to survive it. The Earth is not a machine that can be predicted with simple, linear models. It is a dynamic, chaotic, and unimaginably powerful entity. And right now, that entity is changing its behavior. The physical rock is responding differently to the tectonic forces. The safety valve has failed. The veins have stopped moving. The fault is not creeping. The energy is pooling, transferring, and locking itself away. The silence is deafening, and the pressure is building with every passing second. And this is why you feel that paralyzing anxiety every time there is a tiny microquake in Southern California. This is why you wait in dread, knowing that the infrastructure around you, the highways, the bridges, the power grids, is not ready for a magnitude 8.0 rupture. You read the sensational headlines and you try to laugh it off, hoping it is just fear-mongering designed to get clicks. But deep down, your body knows the truth. The silence is not safety. It is the sound of the Earth holding its breath. The pressure is not gone. It is just waiting. It is locked in the rock, shifting toward the cities, building to a point of absolute inevitable release. You were right to question the silence. You were only wrong about what the silence meant. This brings us to a stark realization about human nature. When faced with data that contradicts a comforting belief, the instinct is to double down on the belief. For 22 years, geophysicists, emergency planners, and millions of residents placed their faith in a mathematical model that was fundamentally flawed. The idea that a massive tectonic system could be timed like a Swiss watch was hubris, plain and simple. The Earth is not a machine built for our convenience. It is a chaotic, breathing entity with its own internal logic. The true danger of the 22-year cycle was never the earthquakes it predicted. The true danger was the complacency it bred. It allowed a generation of people to build their lives, their homes, and their cities on top of a ticking bomb, convinced that they held the remote control. When you finally strip away that complacency, you are left with the unseen groan. The silence of the Cajon Pass, the locked tension of the Garlock Fault, the changing fluid dynamics deep beneath the crust. These are not anomalies. They are the Earth correcting itself. They are the physical manifestations of a planet rebalancing its immense internal pressures. Baba Vanga did not see a mystical curse falling upon the Western land. She saw the Earth in all its terrifying, unyielding reality, finally taking back the control we pretended to have. If you have made it this far and this kind of investigation resonates with you, I encourage you to subscribe. The algorithm only reveals the next layers to those who signal they want to see more. And in our upcoming investigations, the truth gets even more uncomfortable. Now, I want to hear from you. Which layer surprised you the most? Did you believe the 22-year clock was a guarantee of safety? Let me know in the comments below.